The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle as tourists gathered with their cameras, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous Queen's Guard in their iconic red tunics and towering bearskin hats. Among the crowd stood a man whose weathered hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his military beret. What happened next would break a centuries-old tradition and touch millions of hearts around the world, proving that beneath the stoic exterior of Britain's most disciplined soldiers beat hearts capable of extraordinary compassion. The crisp October morning air carried the familiar sounds of Windsor Castle coming to life. Tour groups assembled near the gates, children pressed their faces against the iron railings, and vendors prepared their souvenir stands for another busy day. But in the midst of this typical tourist scene, something extraordinary was about to unfold that would challenge everything people thought they knew about the Queen's Guard. James Mitchell had traveled over 300 miles from his small town in northern England to fulfill a promise he had made to his late wife. At 73 years old, the retired Royal Navy veteran moved slowly through the crowd, his walking stick tapping rhythmically against the ancient stones. His military bearing remained evident despite his age, shoulders squared and back straight even as arthritis made each step a small victory. The red beret on his head bore the insignia of the Royal Marines, a unit he had served with distinction during the war over 4 decades earlier. Around his neck hung a small locket containing a photograph of his beloved wife, who had passed away just 6 months prior after a long battle with cancer. She had always wanted to visit Windsor Castle to see the guards she had admired since childhood, but illness had prevented their planned trip. As James approached the sentry post where one of the Queen's guards stood at attention, he felt a familiar tightness in his chest. The sight of the young soldier, probably no older than 25, brought back a flood of memories from his own days in service. The guard stood perfectly still, his red tunic immaculate, his bearskin hat sitting precisely according to regulation, and his expression hidden behind the traditional stoic mask that had become synonymous with British military tradition. The Queen's Guard, Lance Corporal David, had been on duty since dawn. His training had been rigorous and thorough, drilled into him during months of preparation at the Infantry Training Center. He knew the rules by heart: maintain absolute stillness, ignore all attempts at distraction, speak to no one, and under no circumstances break character while on duty. These weren't merely guidelines but sacred commandments that separated the Queen's Guard from ordinary soldiers. Yet something about the elderly veteran standing before him stirred something deep within his chest. Perhaps it was the way the old man's eyes seemed to carry the weight of untold stories, or the respectful distance he maintained, while other tourists crowded closer with their cameras. There was a recognition between soldiers, an unspoken understanding that transcended ranks and generations. James stood quietly for several minutes, not seeking attention or trying to provoke a reaction like many visitors did. Instead, he simply observed the young guard with the appreciation of someone who understood the discipline and dedication required for such duty. In his pocket, his fingers traced the edges of a worn photograph of, remembering how she used to watch the changing of the guard ceremony on television with such fascination. The crowd around them continued their usual antics. Children made faces at the guard, teenagers posed for selfies, and adults called out jokes and questions, all hoping to crack the soldier's legendary composure. But had weathered thousands of such encounters during his 2 years of service. What he couldn't ignore, however, was the quiet dignity of the man who stood apart from the chaos. Other tourists began to notice the elderly veteran's respectful behavior. Some pointed and whispered, recognizing the military insignia on his beret and the medals pinned to his jacket. A few even stepped back slightly, creating a small circle of space around James, as if sensing that something significant was happening. As the morning progressed, James began to share quiet stories with those around him, speaking just loudly enough for the guard to hear. He talked about his years in the Royal Marines, about the brotherhood he had found in military service, and about the pride he felt watching young soldiers like carry on traditions that stretched back centuries. "I always said the guards were the finest example of British military excellence," James said softly to a family standing nearby. "She would have been so proud to see this young man serving with such honor." His voice carried a gentle tremor, whether from age or emotion, none could tell. Felt something unprecedented happening. In all his training, no one had prepared him for this moment when duty and humanity would collide so powerfully. The old veteran's words weren't seeking to break his composure, but rather to honor it, to acknowledge the sacrifice and dedication it represented. A tour guide leading a group of international visitors noticed the unusual scene developing. She had worked at Windsor Castle for over 15 years and had witnessed countless attempts to distract the guards, but this felt different. The elderly man's presence seemed to command a respect that even the most boisterous tourists couldn't ignore. James continued to stand quietly, occasionally shifting his weight from his good leg to ease the pain in his hip, a souvenir from his military service that had worsened with age. He pulled out his phone and showed his photograph to a young mother standing nearby, explaining how they had planned to visit Windsor together. "She passed last spring," he said simply, his voice carrying decades of love and recent grief. "But I promised her I'd come, that I'd see these fine soldiers she admired so much." The woman wiped away a tear, touched by the simple sincerity of his words. The morning sun climbed higher, casting new patterns of light and shadow across the courtyard. Tour groups came and went, but James remained, as steadfast in his vigil as the guard he observed. There was something profound happening in that space between them, a connection that transcended the barriers of duty and protocol. Found himself fighting an internal battle between his training and his instincts. Every fiber of his military discipline demanded he maintain his position and ignore all distractions. Yet every beat of his heart as a human being recognized the profound respect and grief of the man before him. Other guards began to take notice during their brief moments of communication between shifts. Word spread quietly through the ranks that something extraordinary was developing at post. Senior officers observed from a distance, recognizing that they were witnessing something that couldn't be found in any manual or regulation. As the first part of this remarkable day drew to a close, neither James nor could have predicted how their silent encounter would evolve. The foundation had been laid for something unprecedented in the centuries-long history of the Queen's Guard, something that would challenge traditions while ultimately honoring the deeper values they were meant to protect. The stage was set for a moment that would transform both men's understanding of duty, honor, and human compassion. What began as a simple visit to fulfill a promise to a beloved wife was becoming something far more significant, a testament to the power of respect, recognition, and the unbreakable bonds between those who have served their country. As afternoon approached, the real test of character for both men was about to begin. The question wasn't whether rules would be broken, but whether something more important than rules was about to be honored in a way that would touch hearts around the world. The elderly veteran and the young guard stood facing each other across a divide measured not in feet, but in generations, ranks, and circumstances. Yet somehow, in that ancient courtyard where so much history had unfolded, they were about to create a moment that would be remembered long after both had passed into memory themselves. The first chapter of their extraordinary encounter had concluded, but the most powerful moments were yet to come. What happened next would challenge everything observers thought they knew about military discipline, human compassion, and the true meaning of honor. The afternoon shift began with the precision that had defined the Queen's Guard for centuries. As new soldiers took their positions, the story of the elderly veteran had already begun to ripple through the ranks. Lance Corporal Sarah Williams approached her post near the main gate, having heard whispers about the remarkable scene unfolding at station. James Mitchell remained where he had stood all morning, though his walking stick now bore more of his weight, and his face showed the strain of standing for hours. Several tourists had offered him a chair, but he had politely declined, explaining that a soldier shouldn't sit while another soldier was standing guard. His dedication had begun to draw attention from castle staff and visitors alike, creating an atmosphere of respectful anticipation that was unusual for the typically bustling tourist site. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a military historian visiting from Oxford University, had been observing the scene with growing fascination. She approached James carefully, introducing herself and expressing admiration for his service record, which she had learned about from other visitors who had struck up conversations with him throughout the morning. "I've studied military traditions for over 20 years, Dr. Harper told James quietly, "but I've never witnessed anything quite like this. You're creating something remarkable here, something that honors both the formal traditions and the human heart behind them." James smiled sadly, explaining once again about his love for the Queen's Guard and his promise to visit in her memory. Word of the developing situation had reached the castle's senior staff. Major Robert, the officer commanding the guard unit, arrived to assess the situation personally. His initial concern was that protocol might be compromised, but what he witnessed challenged his understanding of what protocol truly meant to protect and honor. Had now been on duty for over 6 hours, maintaining his position with unwavering discipline despite the emotional weight of James's presence. His training had prepared him for physical endurance, harsh weather, and endless distractions, but nothing had prepared him for the profound respect and shared grief that radiated from the elderly veteran. A group of school children on an educational trip had gathered nearby, their teacher explaining the role and importance of the Queen's Guard. James overheard and began sharing his own insights, speaking about the dedication required for such service and the pride the nation should feel in these young soldiers. "When I was serving in the," James told the children, his voice carrying across the courtyard, "we knew that back home, soldiers like this young man were standing guard, protecting everything we were fighting for. They represent the very best of our military tradition." Several parents found themselves wiping away tears at the simple eloquence of his words. Felt the weight of those words in a way he had never experienced before. His role, which he had sometimes seen as ceremonial, suddenly felt connected to something much larger and more meaningful. The elderly veteran's presence was transforming his understanding of what it meant to serve. Major approached James with military courtesy, introducing himself and thanking him for his service to the nation. The conversation between the two military men, separated by decades and different branches of service, but united by common values, drew a respectful crowd of observers. "Sir," Major said carefully, "I want you to know that your presence here today has been noted by everyone in our unit. What you're doing honors both your wife's memory and our service in a way that moves us all." James expressed his gratitude for the Major's words while emphasizing that he sought no special treatment, only the chance to fulfill his promise too. As the afternoon wore on, something unprecedented began to happen. Other guards, during their brief breaks or shift changes, began to take subtle notice of James's vigil. Word spread through the military quarters about the veteran who had stood respectfully for hours, sharing stories of his service and his late wife's admiration for their traditions. Sergeant Michael, a decorated soldier with 15 years of experience, made a decision that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. During a brief moment when foot traffic was light, he approached James and spoke quietly, expressing the unit's appreciation for his respectful tribute to their service. "Sir, I want you to know that what you're doing today means more to us than you might realize," Sergeant said. "Your respect for our traditions, your understanding of what we represent, it reminds us why we're proud to wear this uniform." The brief conversation, conducted with military precision and genuine emotion, marked a turning point in the day's events. James was visibly moved by the sergeant's words, explaining that he had simply wanted to honor his wife's memory while showing respect for the young soldiers who carried on traditions he had served alongside in his own career. The intersection of personal grief, military honor, and human compassion was creating something beautiful and unprecedented. Dr. Harper continued to document the unfolding events, recognizing that she was witnessing something that would likely be studied by military historians for years to come. The careful balance between maintaining protocol and honoring the deeper values that protocol was meant to protect was playing out in real time. A news reporter from a local television station had arrived, alerted by social media posts about the unusual scene at Windsor Castle. However, out of respect for the solemnity of James's vigil and the military dignity of the guards, she chose to observe quietly rather than intrude with cameras and microphones. Felt a profound shift occurring within himself. The elderly veteran's presence had transformed his duty from a routine assignment into something deeply meaningful. Every moment of his remaining time on guard duty carried new weight and significance, connected to generations of service members who had stood watch before him. The afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting longer shadows across the courtyard. James's endurance was clearly being tested, but his determination remained unshakable. Several castle staff members had quietly arranged for a discreet medical presence nearby, concerned about the elderly veterans after standing for so many hours. Other tourists had begun to modify their behavior in response to the atmosphere James had created. Fewer people attempted to distract the guards, and those who did were often quietly discouraged by fellow visitors who had learned about the veteran's story. A bubble of respect and dignity had formed around the area, transforming the typical tourist experience into something more profound. Major found himself facing a dilemma that wasn't covered in any regulation manual. The strict protocols governing the Queen's Guard had been developed over centuries, designed to maintain the dignity and effectiveness of the unit. Yet here was a situation where rigidly following protocol might actually dishonor the deeper values those protocols were meant to protect. As shift neared its end, both he and James seemed to sense that their encounter was approaching a crucial moment. The young guard had never felt more proud of his service or more aware of its significance. The elderly veteran had found a way to honor both his beloved wife's memory and his own understanding of military brotherhood. The second phase of this remarkable day was drawing to a close, but the most powerful and unprecedented moments were yet to come. What had begun as a simple act of remembrance was evolving into something that would challenge centuries of tradition, while ultimately proving that the highest honor sometimes requires stepping beyond the bounds of regulation. The stage was set for a conclusion that would be talked about for generations, a moment when the true meaning of military service, human compassion, and respect would converge in a way that would touch hearts around the world. The question was no longer whether something extraordinary would happen, but how it would unfold and what it would mean for everyone who witnessed it. The bonds between soldier and veteran, between tradition and humanity, between duty and love, were about to be tested in a way that would reveal the very best of human nature and military honor. The final act of this unprecedented drama was about to begin. The golden hour approached Windsor Castle as evening shadows began to stretch across the ancient stones. James Mitchell had now stood in quiet vigil for nearly 8 hours, his determination unwavering despite visible signs of fatigue. His walking stick bore more of his weight, and his weathered hands showed a slight tremor, but his eyes remained fixed on Lance Corporal with the same respectful attention he had maintained all day. Shift was entering its final hour, but something extraordinary was building in the atmosphere around them. Word had spread throughout the castle complex about the elderly veteran's remarkable tribute, and staff members from various departments had begun to take notice during their breaks. Even senior officers who rarely involved themselves in tourist interactions had quietly observed the unfolding scene. Dr. Harper had spent the afternoon documenting what she increasingly recognized as a historic moment in military tradition. Her academic mind understood the significance of what was happening, but her human heart was equally moved by the simple dignity of James's tribute to his late wife and the profound respect he showed for the young soldiers. Captain James, the senior officer on duty, had been monitoring the situation throughout the day with growing appreciation for its unique nature. His military training emphasized the importance of maintaining protocol, but his experience as a leader had taught him to recognize when something transcended ordinary regulations. A small crowd of respectful observers had gathered, including several military personnel on leave who had come to witness what social media was already calling an extraordinary display of military brotherhood. The atmosphere was unlike anything typically seen at Windsor Castle, marked by quiet reverence rather than tourist excitement. As the time approached for the evening changing of the guard, James pulled out his phone and showed photograph to, holding it up so the young soldier could see it clearly. "This is he said softly, his voice carrying across the quiet courtyard. "She would have been so proud to see you serving with such honor." For the first time all day, felt his composure genuinely challenged. The photograph showed a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, clearly taken during happier times. The love and loss in James's voice as he spoke of her was unmistakable, and the young guard felt something stir deep within his chest that had nothing to do with military protocol and everything to do with human compassion. Major approached the scene as the changing of the guard ceremony was about to begin. The formal ceremony would require to march away from his post, ending the vigil that had captivated everyone who witnessed it. The Major faced a decision that would either uphold centuries of rigid tradition or acknowledge something more profound than any written regulation. "Lance Corporal," Major said quietly, approaching close enough that only and James could hear him clearly. "I want you to know that your conduct today has the highest traditions of the Queen's Guard. You have shown that true discipline includes knowing when compassion serves a higher purpose than rigid adherence to protocol." The Major then turned to James with deep respect. "Sir, your tribute to your wife and your respect for our service has moved everyone who has witnessed it. With your permission, I would like to present you with something that I believe would honor both your service and your wife's memory." James looked surprised, explaining that he sought no recognition, only the chance to fulfill his promise too. Major smiled and gestured to Sergeant, who approached carrying a small ceremonial item that would normally never leave the guard quarters. "This is a Queen's Guard cap badge," the Major explained, "worn by every soldier who has stood these posts. I would like you to have it, not as a tourist souvenir, but as recognition from one soldier to another, and as a tribute to your wife's appreciation for our service." The moment was profoundly moving, watched by dozens of silent observers who understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. James accepted the badge with hands that shook slightly, not from age but from emotion, expressing his gratitude while explaining that would have treasured such recognition. But the most extraordinary moment was yet to come. Who had maintained perfect military bearing for over 8 hours, made a decision that would have seemed impossible at the beginning of the day. As the formal changing of the guard began, he did something that broke centuries of protocol while paradoxically honoring the deepest values that protocol was meant to protect. Instead of marching directly away from his post as regulations required, turned slightly toward James and performed a slow, deliberate salute. It was not the crisp, regulation salute of military ceremony, but something more personal and profound, a recognition between soldiers that transcended rank, age, and formal duty. The crowd fell completely silent, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something historic. James, despite his age and the walking stick in one hand, straightened his shoulders and returned the salute with military precision, his own service record evident in the dignity of his response. The moment lasted only seconds, but its impact was immeasurable. Major, rather than reprimanding for breaking protocol, stepped forward and added his own salute to the exchange, followed by Sergeant and every other guard within sight. What began as one soldier's compassionate response to human dignity became a spontaneous military tribute that honored both service and humanity. Dr. Harper, witnessing the scene with tears in her eyes, later wrote that she had observed the evolution of military tradition in real time, a moment when the highest values of service found expression beyond the boundaries of regulation, proving that true discipline includes the wisdom to know when compassion serves a greater good than rigid protocol. The changing of the guard proceeded with unusual solemnity, each soldier's bearing reflecting the profound experience they had shared. Marched away from his post, but the connection forged between veteran and active duty soldier would endure long beyond the ceremonial duties of any single day. James remained for a few more minutes, speaking quietly with Major about his service in the end, sharing stories of lifelong admiration for British military traditions. The Major listened with genuine interest, recognizing in the elderly veteran the same dedication to service that motivated the soldiers under his command. As evening settled over Windsor Castle, James prepared to begin his long journey home. The castle staff had arranged for assistance with transportation, moved by his dedication and the extraordinary day he had created. Several guards, now off duty, came to bid him farewell, expressing their gratitude for the dignity he had brought to their service. Before leaving, James placed a single white flower at the base of his former post, a final tribute to and acknowledgement of the young soldiers who had honored both their service and her memory. The gesture was simple but profound, witnessed by the small group of people who had remained to see the conclusion of this remarkable story. The news of what became known as the Windsor Salute spread quickly through social media and traditional news outlets. The story touched millions of hearts around the world, with military personnel from dozens of countries sharing their own experiences of how respect and recognition between service members could transcend all boundaries. When interviewed days later, explained that James's presence had transformed his understanding of what it meant to serve. "He reminded me that we don't just guard buildings or follow protocols," the young soldier said. "We represent something larger than ourselves, something that connects us to everyone who has ever served and to the values they defended." Major faced no disciplinary action for allowing the unprecedented salute exchange. Instead, senior commanders recognized that his decision represented military leadership at its finest, understanding when flexibility serves honor better than rigid adherence to regulation. The incident became a case study in military academies about the balance between tradition and humanity. James returned home with the Queen's Guard badge and memories that fulfilled his promise to in ways he had never imagined. He established a small memorial garden in their backyard, where the badge was displayed alongside his photograph and mementos from his own military service. The story continued to resonate months later, inspiring similar acts of recognition between veterans and active duty personnel around the world. It demonstrated that the highest military traditions aren't threatened by acts of humanity, but rather strengthened by them, proving that true discipline includes the wisdom to know when compassion serves a greater purpose than protocol. The elderly veteran and the young guard had created something beautiful together, a moment that honored the past while inspiring the future. Their encounter proved that military service, at its finest, is not just about following orders or maintaining traditions, but about recognizing and honoring the human dignity that those traditions are meant to protect. Years later, both men would remember that October day as one of the most meaningful of their lives, a testament to the power of respect, recognition, and the unbreakable bonds that connect all who have answered the call to serve their country with honor and distinction.